In this lesson, we're going to make the program a little easier to maintain. We'll do that by catching any exceptions that happen anywhere in the program and writing them to a log file. Hopefully we won't have too many exceptions, but this is a good thing to have in most programs because once something does break, without a log file, you don't really have a good way to know what happened. We'll start this by opening the solution. And in the engine project, I created a new services folder and created a new class called logging service. Class is over here. It's a static class because we don't want to have to instantiate a logging service. We just want to call a function on it and write to our log file. I have a constant here for the log file directory, which I named logs. The static constructor on lines 10 through 18 will go out and it will combine the directory that the current application is running in, its base directory, with the log file directory, this constant we have here, and that's going to be the directory it's going to look for to write the log files. If that directory does not exist, it's going to create the directory for us. We need it in place before we can start writing the log files there. On lines 20 through 36, we have our static function that's a log function. It takes an exception object and an optional parameter of is this an inner exception. Now if you aren't familiar with exceptions, the way that they track what happens is, let's say function A calls function B calls function C, and then something breaks in function C. You have something called a stack trace, so you know what the flow of the program was. You know what was the last line that was run in function A when it went to function B. You know what was the last line in function B that called function C, and you want to know what line the program actually broke at in function C. And that's your stack trace. It's the function chain that got to where the code broke. And we want to write out all of those so we know the flow that the program took before it broke. And what we do here on line 22 is we open a stream writer to our log file name function, and all this does is it's the function down here on 38 to 44 that's going to combine the current applications directory with the log file directory and give it a name with a date time now formatted to year, month, day. This way we'll have a different log file for each day. Probably don't need it for this program, but for large production systems where you could have dozens of errors or hundreds of errors, especially if something like a database server goes down, it's a good idea to have smaller log files than just have one huge log file that could be a megabyte. So this log file name function just gives us a unique name for that day. And then back in the log function, we write a line and we say whether it's an inner exception or the root exception. We do a little hyphen, a line of hyphens or equal signs. And if you haven't seen this before, new string, and then giving the first parameter a value, some sort of string value or a character, comma 40. This just means build us a string that's going to be 40 repetitions of whatever this is. And here for the inner exceptions we use just a minus sign, and for the exceptions we use an equal sign. You'll see how this looks when we actually run the program and have it cause an error and then look at the log file. Then we write out the exceptions message. This will tell us roughly what the exception did, and then the stack trace that tells us how it got there. And we write a blank line just to make it a little bit easier to read. If this exception, the one that was passed in as a parameter, has an inner exception, so if it's not null, then it's just going to recursively call the log function again, passing in the inner exception and true, since this time around it's an inner exception. Now to get this to work, we could catch exceptions throughout the program, but I want to make sure we catch any exception that happens anywhere in the program. And we'll do that by going into the WPF UI project and going into the app.xaml file. And at the application level, we're going to add a new attribute here dispatcher unhandled exception equals app on dispatcher unhandled exception. So this tells the application that if an exception happens somewhere and we don't handle it, then we want to send it off to this function. And this function exists in the app.xaml.cs. It's a new function we're adding. We build some exception message text where we say the exception occurred, the message, a couple of carriage return line feeds, and then the stack trace information. Then we call the new logging service log function that's going to log the exception to disk. And then we do a message box show that shows this text we just created so the user can see that something happened. This would be nice to have an actual WPF window to display this with a little bit more information. Maybe let the user copy paste or send an email to the support team. But for right now, we're just going to go with a simple messagebox.show. So now that we have the exception logging in place, we need to actually have an exception. So I went into the item factory class, and in the create game item function, I just added 2 lines, 36 and 37. You don't need to add these on your program. I'm just doing this to demonstrate how an exception would work. And I declare an x variable with the value of 0, and then I say variable y equals 1 divided by x. In this case, x is 0, so we're going to get a divide by 0 exception. Before we run the program, I'll show you the directory. Over here, I have the project running in this projects open source SOS/CS RPG folder. Here's the WPF UI project, the bin folder, the debug folder, since we're building this in debug mode. And right now I have a game data folder and an images folder. When I run this, we should get a logs folder, and our log file with our error message will be in there. Now we'll run the program. We see that we get a divide by 0 error, and since I have catch exceptions or stop on exceptions, I have to hit the continue to actually let this go through the exception logging code. And it showed the messagebox.show on my other screen, but this is what it would say. Now if we go back to the folder, we see in our debug folder we now have a logs folder. And I have this SOS/CS/RPG _ 20/02/16, since it's 2020 is the year, 02 is the month, 16 is the day, and log. And if I open this with Notepad, here's a log of the error. So now if you have a program and the user says it crashed, you can say send me the log file, and you'll see here's the date, here's the time, here's what happened, here's the inner exception. You know exactly what line it happened on. Here's your stack trace. So your item factory, your game session, your window.xaml, that's your stack trace. And you know this was a divide by 0 error. Hopefully an error log won't be that useful for us for this program, but like I said, if you're writing production systems, this can be extremely helpful. In the description below the video, I'll have a link to the source code, and I'll also have a couple other links. One is going to be to a new project folder I created on GitHub. So if you go to the SOS/CS/RPG project and go into projects and select the one project we have there, you'll see kind of what I'm planning to work on next, and you'll see as I move something into in progress, I'll start working on it, and you know that's the next lesson that will be coming up. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can save them on the support page on my website, or you can leave a comment below the video. And as you can see, in the next thing, we're going to work on putting string literals into resource files for internationalization. If I stop the program, and if we go look at main window.xaml, we have things like our label here for name, for class, for hit points, gold. If we scroll down to our our data grids. We have headers like description, quantity, price, which is great if you're playing this and you speak English, but if you speak a different language, we don't have an easy way to go change this. With the resource files, we can put all of these literals in one place, and we can say, go look it up there. And with a Spanish version of the resource file, it will have all the Spanish words for description, name, class, hit points. This way we can easily internationalize this. I'll also have a link to the Discord server below the video in case you want to go there and leave some messages. That's another place I'm going to try to make it a little bit easier to communicate, hopefully, with anyone else who's developing along. And I'll talk to you later.